My son paid for my vacation at the sea. A whole month, Mom. I was jumping with joy. But at night I heard, while she's away, we'll transfer her house and disappear with the money. I went to bed, but didn't sleep a wink. And in the morning, instead of the airport, I went to, good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I want you to picture a Tuesday evening in late September, the kind that smells like dried leaves and the last of the summer roses. That was the evening my son called to tell me he had a gift for me, and I was so happy I nearly dropped the phone. My name is Martha Calloway. I am 68 years old, and I have lived in the same house on Birchwood Lane in Columbus, Ohio, for 34 years. It is not a grand house. It is a 2-bedroom, white-sided house with a green door that my late husband, Gerald, painted himself the summer before he passed. The garden is mine. Every azalea, every rosebush, every stubborn little patch of lavender that refuses to grow where I plant it. That house is the only thing Gerald and I built together that is still standing. It is worth, according to the county assessor, about $240,000. It is worth everything to me. I lived quietly. I had my routine, morning coffee, the news, a walk through the neighborhood, a phone call with my friend Elise on Wednesdays. I volunteered at the library on Thursdays. I was not lonely, or at least I told myself I was not. My son Daniel was 41. He had his father's height and, I thought then, his father's decency. He worked in sales, home improvement products, something about windows, and he had married Christina 6 years earlier. Christina was polished and efficient the way a freshly sharpened knife is polished and efficient. She had small, quick eyes and a smile that appeared and disappeared like a light being switched on and off. I had never warmed to her, but I told myself that was my shortcoming, not hers. She made Daniel happy, or seemed to. That was enough. They lived 40 minutes away in a newer development. The kind of neighborhood with matching mailboxes and HOA rules about fence height. They had 2 car payments, a mortgage that I knew, though Daniel never said so directly, was stretching them thin, and a lifestyle that seemed always to require just a little more than they had. Daniel called me that Tuesday evening, and he sounded warm and generous in a way that, I realize now, should have made me pay closer attention. "Mom," he said, "Christina and I want to do something for you, something real. You never take a vacation. You never spend money on yourself. We found a place, a little rental cottage right on the coast in South Carolina. A full month, Mom. October. The weather's perfect. We'll handle everything. Flights, the cottage, spending money, all of it." I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my cheek, looking out at the garden in the fading light, and feeling something fill up in my chest. It had been 11 years since Gerald died. 11 years of managing everything alone. And here was my son, my boy, telling me he saw that, and he wanted to give me something beautiful. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I cried a little, and Daniel laughed and told me not to be so sentimental, and we talked for 20 minutes about the cottage and the beach and what I should pack. That night, I went to bed early, lighter than I had felt in years. I did not fall asleep right away. The house makes sounds at night, the pipes, the settling of old wood, and I had long ago made peace with those sounds. So when I heard voices, at first I thought I was drifting into a dream, but I was not. The voices were coming from outside my bedroom window, which faces the driveway. Daniel's car was in the driveway. He had stopped by that afternoon to drop off some paperwork for the trip, and he must have stayed to talk with Christina on the phone while sitting in the car. The window was open 2 inches. The night was still. I heard Christina's voice first. I recognized the clipped, precise way she spoke, even through the tinny echo of the speakerphone. A full month is more than enough time. The attorney said it takes 2 weeks, tops. We get the quit claim signed before she boards, file it while she's gone, and by the time she comes back, Daniel's voice, lower, she'll figure it out. By then it won't matter. We're underwater, Daniel. The house is the only option. You know that. Silence. Then, she'll be so relaxed she won't know what hit her. I lay in my bed without moving. The sheets felt cold. Outside, a car started and drove away. The neighborhood returned to its Tuesday night quiet. I did not sleep. I stared at the ceiling of the bedroom where Gerald and I had slept for 26 years, and I thought, my son just sold me a vacation so he could steal my house. Was this real? Had I really just heard what I thought I heard? I ran it back. Every word. The attorney. The quitclaim deed. 2 weeks. By the time she comes back. Yes, it was real. And what I did next would determine whether I kept everything I had left of Gerald or lost it forever. I got up at 5 in the morning because lying in that bed had become unbearable. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in my robe, and I let myself do the thing I had been resisting since midnight. I thought it all the way through. A quitclaim deed. I knew what that was. Gerald and I had used one when we refinanced years ago. It is a document by which a property owner signs over their ownership rights to another person. Quickly, without a title search, without the normal protections of a sale. In Ohio, a quitclaim deed is legally valid the moment it is signed and notarized. It does not require the new owner to inform anyone. It does not require a sale price. And once it is filed with the county recorder, it is extraordinarily difficult to undo. The phrase, "get the quitclaim signed before she boards," meant one thing. They intended to put a document in front of me under some innocent-sounding pretext. Perhaps something about updating estate paperwork, perhaps something framed as a formality for the trip, and have me sign away my house without understanding what I was signing. I sat with that for a long time. The fear came first, the way fear always does. A cold, spreading feeling in the stomach. My son. My boy. The child I had driven to baseball practice and held when his father died and called every Sunday for 11 years. He was going to let his wife talk him into stealing from me. Maybe he had not needed much talking. Maybe this had been his idea. I did not know. And that not knowing was its own kind of grief. Then the fear passed, or rather it moved aside for something else. A clear, flat anger. The kind that does not shout. The kind that plans. I was 68 years old, not 98. I had run a household, managed a budget, raised a child, survived a husband's death. I was not confused or feeble. I was a woman who understood how things worked, and I was not going to sit in this kitchen and let myself be robbed. I opened the notepad I keep by the phone for grocery lists and I began to write. First, what did they have so far? An attorney. Someone already advising them on the deed. That meant the plan was not theoretical. It was in motion, which meant I had days, not weeks. Second, what were they counting on? My ignorance, my trust, my being 30 hours away on a South Carolina beach when the document was filed. The vacation was not a gift. It was logistics. Third, what could I do? I wrote for an hour. I crossed things out. I thought about calling Daniel and confronting him directly, and I crossed that out immediately. If I confronted him, one of two things would happen. He would deny everything, and I would have no proof, or he would accelerate the plan before I had any protection in place. Either way, I lost. I thought about doing nothing, simply not going on the trip. But if I canceled without explanation, They would know something had shifted, and they might find another way. A different document, a different pretext, a different window of time, number. What I needed was to let them believe the plan was still on track, while quietly, carefully, making the plan impossible to execute. The key was the deed itself. They could not file a quitclaim deed without my signature, and my signature on a legal document required me to be present and, critically, required notarization. A notary must verify identity and, in Ohio, is legally obligated to confirm the signer is acting voluntarily and understands the document. So the first thing I needed was a lawyer. Not eventually. Today. I needed someone who could tell me exactly what protections I could put in place before my supposed departure date. I needed to understand whether there was any other document, a power of attorney, some piece of paperwork Daniel might try to use, that could transfer property rights without my physical signature. I needed to know every door, and I needed to close every one of them. I had a neighbor, Louise, whose daughter was a paralegal at a firm downtown. I had heard the name, Hartwell and Associates, more than once. Family law, estate planning. They would know property law. I wrote down the number. Then I wrote down one more thing, underlined twice. Act normal. The flight Daniel had booked was in 4 days. 4 days in which I needed to call a lawyer, understand my options, take whatever protective steps were available, and meanwhile answer Daniel's texts warmly, ask about the weather in South Carolina, and behave exactly like a mother who could not wait to go to the beach. 4 days. I had done harder things in less time. I dressed, I ate a piece of toast, and at 9 o'clock sharp I picked up the phone. The offices of Hartwell and Associates were on the 4th floor of a building on North High Street, the kind of office where the carpet is dark blue and the diplomas on the wall are in matching frames. I was there by 10:15. The attorney who saw me was a woman named Carol Hartwell, the founding partner's daughter-in-law, I later learned, who had taken over the estate planning side of the practice. She was perhaps 50, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the careful, listening expression of someone who has heard a great many painful family stories without letting them harden her. I told her everything. I spoke for perhaps 20 minutes without stopping, and she took notes on a legal pad and did not interrupt me. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me. "What you heard," she said, "describes what's called a fraudulent conveyance. If someone obtains your signature on a deed through deception, misrepresenting what the document is, that deed can be voided. But voiding it after the fact means litigation, months of court time, significant cost. The better approach is to make sure the document can never be filed in the first place, or to create a clear, dated legal record of your intent that makes any subsequent filing impossible to defend." She laid out my options clearly and without drama, the way I appreciated. The first and most immediate option was to record a document with the Franklin County Recorder's Office, a declaration of homestead, together with a letter of intent stating explicitly that I was not authorizing any transfer of the property, and that any deed purporting to convey my interest that was filed without a corresponding notarized statement from my attorney was to be considered fraudulent. This would not prevent them from attempting to file, but it would create an immediate flag in the public record. The second option was to update my estate documents, my will and any existing power of attorney, to explicitly remove Daniel as executor or agent, replacing him with someone I trusted. As long as Daniel held power of attorney, he potentially had a legal instrument with which to act on my behalf. I stared at her. "He has power of attorney?" She looked at me over her notepad. "Does he?" I had given Daniel a general power of attorney 4 years ago after a brief hospitalization. The document was meant for emergencies. If I were incapacitated, someone needed to be able to manage my affairs. I had not thought about it since. "Yes," I said, "I think he still does." Carol Hartwell was quiet for a moment. then we need to revoke it today. A power of attorney can be revoked at any time by the principal, simply by signing a written revocation and having it notarized. I'll draft one before you leave. I felt the floor shift slightly beneath me, the way it had when Gerald died. That sudden awareness of how much weight you had been resting on something without knowing it. Daniel had power of attorney. He might not even need my signature on a deed. With a broad enough instrument, an attorney willing to stretch its interpretation could potentially argue he had authority to act on my behalf regarding property. We spent the next 2 hours working through everything. I signed a revocation of the power of attorney, notarized by Carol's assistant on the spot. I signed the declaration of homestead. I updated my will, removing Daniel as executor and naming instead my friend Elise, who was honest and careful and had no financial entanglements with anyone in my family. I also signed a specific exclusion clause, a document stating that no transfer of the property at Birchwood Lane had been authorized by me to be filed with the county recorder that afternoon. Carol walked me through each document plainly and patiently. When we were done, she folded her hands on the desk. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I want to ask you directly. Is there anything more you need right now? You said you heard this conversation 2 nights ago. How are you sleeping?" "I'm not," I said. She nodded. "I'd also suggest you consider making a discreet audio record of any further conversations with your son or his wife. Ohio is a one-party consent state, which means you are legally permitted to record a conversation you are a party to. If they present you with any paperwork to sign, you have every right to photograph it and send it to me immediately before signing anything." I drove home with a folder of documents in my passenger seat and my hands steady on the wheel. I pulled into the driveway on Birchwood Lane and looked at the green door. Gerald painted that door, I thought, and no one is taking it. That evening, Daniel texted to ask if I had packed yet. I wrote back, "Working on it. So excited." "Thank you again, sweetheart." I pressed send and set the phone face down on the counter. 2 days later, he called and asked if I could stop by their house before the airport, just to say goodbye and pick up some travel documents he had printed for me. Travel documents. I knew what that meant. I said, "Of course, I'll be there at 9. I called Carol before I went to bed. I drove to Daniel and Christina's house on a Thursday morning wearing my good coat and carrying my purse, and I looked exactly like a woman on her way to the airport. I had my carry-on bag in the trunk. I had printed a boarding pass. I had done everything right. Christina met me at the door. She was dressed well, as always, and she gave me a hug that lasted exactly the length of time a hug is supposed to last, no more. Inside, Daniel was at the kitchen table with a manila envelope. "These are your travel documents," he said. "Cottage confirmation, your itinerary, and I also printed something. It's just a formality, estate planning. The attorney suggested we update some paperwork while the timing's good." He slid the envelope across the table and smiled. "Nothing complicated." I picked up the envelope. I opened it slowly. Inside, beneath the printed itinerary, was a deed. A quit-claim deed, already filled out, bearing my name as grantor and Daniel's name as grantee. The property, 14 Birchwood Lane, Columbus, Ohio. I looked at it for a long moment. I set it on the table. "I'm not going to sign this," I said. Christina had been standing by the counter. Something in her posture changed. A tightening. "Mom, it's a quit-claim deed," I said. "It transfers the house to Daniel. I know what it is. I'm not signing it." Daniel stood up slowly. "Mom, you're misunderstanding. I revoked your power of attorney on Monday," I said. "I filed a declaration of homestead and a statement of non-authorization with the county recorder on Monday afternoon. I also updated my will. You are no longer my executor." I kept my voice level. "I want you to know that I'm aware of what was planned, and it's no longer possible." The kitchen went very quiet. Christina's face went still in a way I had not seen before. Not surprised, exactly. recalibrating. Then Daniel said quietly, "You're making a mistake." "How is protecting my own property a mistake?" "Because we're family." His voice had a new texture to it, something with edges. "Because you're 68 years old and you live alone, and one day you won't be able to manage that house. And when that day comes, you'll need us. And if you want to play it this way, fine. But don't expect us to be there when things get hard." I picked up my purse. "I hope they don't get hard," I said. "But if they do, I'll manage." Christina stepped toward me. "Martha." Her voice was controlled, smooth. "We could make this very unpleasant for you. You have no idea what we've already put in motion. Documents, attorneys, statements. We can contest your mental competency. We can file claims against the estate. We can make the next 2 years of your life expensive and exhausting." I looked at her. I had rehearsed this moment. Not the words exactly, but the decision to stand in it without flinching. "I've spoken to an attorney," I said. "Everything I've done is documented. Everything I've said in this kitchen this morning is also documented." I reached into my coat pocket and held up my phone. The recording app had been running since I walked through the door. Carol had advised me to say this out loud, clearly, for the record, and to make certain they heard it. Christina took a step back. Daniel's face had gone a dull red. "You recorded us?" "Ohio is a one-party consent state," I said, precisely as Carol had told me. "I was a party to this conversation." I walked to the door. Neither of them moved to stop me. "I'll be home if you want to talk," I said, "like a family." I drove home, pulled into the driveway, sat in the car for 10 minutes, and shook. Not with fear, with the release of something that had been pressed very hard against my ribs for 4 days. I did not go on the trip to South Carolina. I called the airline from the driveway and canceled the ticket. It had been booked in my name, and the refund came back to my card within a week. I spent the next 3 days doing very little. I walked in the garden. I made soup. I called Elise and told her the broad shape of what had happened, leaving out the details until I was ready for them. I slept 9 hours the first night and did not dream. The green door looked exactly as it always had. I thought about Gerald, and I felt for the first time in a long while that he would have been proud of me. 8 days after the scene in their kitchen, Daniel called. I was in the garden, kneeling in the bed by the back fence, pulling up the last of the season's growth before the first frost. My phone was in my cardigan pocket. I saw his name on the screen, and I sat back on my heels and let it ring twice before I answered. "Mom." His voice was careful and composed, in the way that voices are when they have been prepared. "I want to apologize. I think things got out of hand. Christina and I have been under a lot of financial pressure, and we made a terrible decision. I'm not proud of it." I listened. I was hoping we could talk. Actually, talk. Have dinner, the 3 of us. Work through this. I looked at the azaleas along the fence. Gerald had planted those the second spring we lived here. They were old plants now, woody at the base, and they bloomed reliably every year without anyone having to do much for them. I had always admired that about them. "I appreciate you calling, Daniel," I said. "So we can have dinner?" "I'll think about it," I said. There was a pause. "Mom, I made a mistake. I'm trying to make it right." "You tried to steal my house," I said pleasantly, in the tone one might use to note the weather. "I don't think dinner is the immediate next step, but I appreciate the call." I ended the call and set the phone on the edge of the planter. I noticed, with some interest, that I felt nothing much. Not satisfaction, not sadness, not the old reflex of wanting to smooth things over and make everyone comfortable. Just a kind of clear, settled quiet. When you have spent 4 days afraid and then several more days letting the fear metabolize into resolve, you arrive somewhere else. A place where the noise other people make simply doesn't reach you the same way. I knew they were watching. I was not naive about that. They had not abandoned the situation simply because I had made it legally difficult for them. What they had done was regroup. The dinner invitation was a reconnaissance mission, as much as an olive branch. They wanted to know where I stood, what I knew, who I had spoken to, whether there was any softness in me they could work with. There was not. I did, however, need to talk to someone. Not a lawyer. Carol had been invaluable, and I knew I would call her again if necessary. But a friend. Someone who knew me before any of this, who had no stake in the outcome, who would simply listen. That person was Elise. Elise Drummond was 65 and had been my closest friend for 22 years. She had retired from teaching middle school the previous spring and was in the process of deciding what to do with her time, which mostly meant she was available and also extremely good at cutting through nonsense. I called her on Wednesday, as we always did, and this time I told her everything. I started at the beginning, the phone call from Daniel, the joy I had felt, the conversation outside my bedroom window, and I went all the way through to the scene in the kitchen and the garden phone call the previous week. I told her about Carol and the deed and the recording. I told her about the power of attorney. Elise was quiet for almost a full minute when I finished. "Martha," she said finally. "Good Lord." "I know. And you did all of that in 4 days." "I had to." "You had to," she repeated, and I could hear her sitting up straighter, the way she used to before she had a hard conversation with a student's parent. "Okay, here's what you're not going to do. You're not going to second-guess yourself. You did exactly what you should have done. You did it cleanly and legally, and you didn't tip your hand until the last moment. That's not paranoia. That's survival." "I feel like I should feel worse about it," I said. "He's my son." "He tried to steal your house," she said. "You can grieve the relationship separately from defending yourself. Those are two different things. Don't confuse them." I wrote that down on my notepad. We talked for 90 minutes. By the end, I had eaten half a plate of crackers and felt enormously better. "What does Carol say is next?" Elise asked. "She says to wait and document. If they attempt anything else, I'll have a pattern of behavior on record." And she mentioned very carefully that depending on how this develops, there might be grounds for a fraud complaint. But she doesn't want to push that direction unless we have to. "How do you feel about that?" "Like someone who's already won one round," I said, "and knows the fight isn't over." Elise laughed. A real laugh, warm and a little fierce. "Good. That's exactly how you should feel." They came on a Saturday afternoon, unannounced. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard the car in the driveway, and I looked out the window above the sink and recognized Christina's silver sedan. I set down the kettle. I breathed once, slowly. I had been expecting something like this. Not today, specifically, but something. Because the week of quiet had been too long. People like Christina did not simply accept setbacks. They consolidated and redirected and arrived, eventually, at your front door. I went to the door before they knocked. They were both dressed as though this were a Sunday brunch. Daniel in a collared shirt, Christina in a blue jacket I had seen her wear to Daniel's work events. They were carrying flowers. Pink dahlias. "We wanted to see you," Daniel said. He looked tired, genuinely tired in a way that was new, and I filed that away. "Can we come in?" I stepped back and let them in. We sat in the living room, the room with Gerald's old armchair that I kept by the window, and the sofa, and the photographs on the mantel. Christina set the dahlias on the coffee table and folded her hands in her lap. Daniel spoke first. "Mom, I meant what I said on the phone. I am sorry. What we did was wrong." He met my eyes, and for a moment he looked so much like Gerald at 40 that my chest tightened. I panicked. "We're behind on the mortgage by 4 months. The car payments. I felt like I was drowning, and I made a decision that was inexcusable. "I understand," I said. "I meant it. Christina leaned forward slightly. Martha, what we want, what we're asking, is for you to consider what this kind of conflict does to a family. Her voice was warm, measured. The teacher voice. The voice designed to make you feel that the reasonable thing is also the easy thing. You're right that we made an error in judgment. But the way you handled it, the attorney, the documents, the recording, it turned a family matter into something adversarial. And honestly, what does that accomplish? You have the house. Nothing's been taken. Can we not just let it go? For the sake of what we are to each other? And there it was. The reframe, the slow pivot from "we did wrong" to "you escalated." I had been watching for it. Christina, I said, I want to make sure I understand you. You're suggesting that the appropriate response to learning that someone plans to fraudulently transfer your property is to handle it quietly within the family and not involve attorneys or legal protections. She opened her mouth. Because I want to be clear, I said, about what letting it go would have meant if I had done it before I took those steps. It would have meant arriving home from South Carolina to find that my son had filed a deed transferring my house into his name using a power of attorney I didn't know he still had. At that point, letting it go would have meant losing my home. Martha, the legal steps I took didn't make this adversarial, I said. The plan you made to deceive me made it adversarial. I just made sure I had documentation. There was a silence. Daniel looked at the floor. Christina's face had lost its warmth. There's another thing I'd like you to consider, Christina said, and her voice now had that cooler edge I had heard in my driveway all those nights ago. You're 68, and you live alone. Daniel is your next of kin. Whether you like it or not, there will come a time when decisions are made about your care, your finances, your living situation. How you treat us now affects how we'll be positioned to help you, or not, later. I looked at her for a moment. That sounds like a threat, I said. It's a reality, she said. I've updated my will, I said. My affairs are in order. I have a very good attorney and a very capable executor. I think we're finished here. Daniel stood slowly. His face was the dark red I remembered from the kitchen, but he said nothing. Christina picked up her purse. You'll regret this, she said. I'll take my chances. They left. I stood at the window and watched the silver sedan back out of my driveway and disappear around the corner. Then I sat down in Gerald's old armchair, and I felt afraid. Not the sharp fear of immediate threat, but something slower and more human. The fear that comes when you understand you have permanently altered a relationship, that the son in Daniel's body had made choices that could not simply be walked back, and that the life you thought you were living had been, for some time, different from the life that was actually occurring. The fear was real. I let it be real. But underneath it, harder and more durable than the fear, was something else. The absolute certainty that I had done the right thing. And that certainty, I found, was enough to stand on. 3 weeks after Daniel and Christina left my living room for the last time, I sat in a conference room in the offices of Hartwell and Associates and watched my son try and fail to lie to a room full of people who do this for a living. Carol had moved things forward more quickly than I had anticipated. When I brought her the recording from Daniel's kitchen, the clean, clear audio of Christina explaining the quitclaim scheme, of Daniel confirming the plan, she had listened to it twice, asked me a series of precise questions, and then told me, with the careful language of someone who does not like to overpromise, that I had something meaningful. This recording, combined with the deed they prepared and attempted to present to you, and combined with the existing power of attorney that was in force at the time of the conversation, gives us a documented pattern, she said. In Ohio, that pattern is consistent with a charge of attempted fraud. More immediately, it gives you grounds for a civil action. And if we proceed, we do so in a forum where that document speaks for itself. I had agreed. Carol had reached out to Daniel's attorney through proper channels, and a meeting had been arranged. Not a court hearing, but a mediated conference with a neutral third party. The kind of meeting that often precedes litigation and also frequently prevents it, because it forces everyone into the same room with the same facts. Daniel came with an attorney I did not recognize. A younger man in a tight suit who spent the first 10 minutes establishing, with some aggression, that Daniel had only been trying to help manage his mother's estate in advance of an anticipated period of incapacity and had not intended to act without her full understanding. I watched Daniel while his attorney spoke. He sat at the far end of the table and he did not look at me. He looked at a spot slightly above the table surface, the way people look when they are trying to appear composed and are not quite succeeding. His hands were flat on the table. I noticed that his wedding ring was slightly loose. I do not know why I noticed that, but I did. He had lost weight since October. Carol waited until Daniel's attorney had finished speaking. Then she played the recording. The room was quiet in the way that only legal proceedings can be quiet. A purposeful, noting silence. The mediator's face did not change. Daniel's attorney looked at the table. Daniel himself, I was watching him, went still in a way that was different from composure. It was the stillness of someone realizing that the version of events they had prepared was no longer usable. When the recording ended, Carol placed the prepared deed on the table. Daniel's name, my property, filled out in advance. The date on the document was 4 days before my supposed departure, before any conversation between Daniel and me about estate paperwork had occurred. The deed was completed before Mrs. Calloway was presented with it, Carol said, which is inconsistent with the claim that this was a spontaneous or informal discussion about estate planning. Additionally, the power of attorney in effect at the time would have given Mr. Calloway independent authority to file certain documents. The revocation of that instrument was not, as Mr. Calloway's counsel has implied, an act of hostility. It was a necessary protection. Daniel's attorney asked for a recess. In the hallway, I stood at the window and looked down at North High Street, 4 stories below. The city went about its business. A bus pulled away from the curb. A woman walked quickly with coffee in both hands. A delivery truck idled at the intersection. All of it completely indifferent to what was happening in the conference room above, as the world is always indifferent to the private catastrophes of families. I thought about the Tuesday evening in September when Daniel had called and how full of warmth I had felt. How real that warmth had seemed. Had any of it been real on his side? I did not know and suspected I never would. Some questions do not get answered. They simply become part of the geography of a life. Features you learn to navigate around. I was not angry. I want to be precise about this. Standing there at that moment, I was not angry at all. I had been afraid and then resolved, and then quietly determined, but not angry. Daniel was my son. What he had done was a betrayal so fundamental it had restructured something in me permanently. But anger requires a certain amount of disbelief, and I no longer had any disbelief left about who he had decided to be. The recess lasted 20 minutes. When we reconvened, Daniel's attorney presented a settlement offer. Daniel would sign a formal acknowledgement that no transfer of the property had occurred or been authorized, would pay Carol's legal fees, and would have no further claim or legal standing with regard to the property at Birchwood Lane for as long as I lived there. It did not include an apology. I had not expected one. I had stopped expecting things from Daniel that required him to be someone other than who he had shown me he was. Carol looked at me. I nodded once. "Mrs. Calloway accepts," she said. Daniel signed. He still did not look at me. Not once during the entire signing. Not when his attorney slid the papers across. Not when he uncapped the pen. Not when he handed the papers back. Whatever he felt in that room, shame or resentment or simply exhaustion, he kept it in a place I was not invited to see. We left through separate doors. In the elevator going down, Carol said, "You did well in there." "I didn't do anything," I said. "I just let the recording speak." She smiled. "That's usually how it works." The settlement was signed on a Wednesday in early December, 4 weeks after the conference. The legal acknowledgement that Daniel signed was a matter of public record, filed with the county alongside the existing documents Carol had prepared in October. Anyone doing a title search on 14 Birchwood Lane would now find a clean, clear paper trail. My declaration of homestead, my revocation of power of attorney, and a signed acknowledgement by my son that no transfer of the property had occurred or been authorized. The house was documented as mine in every way that a house can be documented. I went to the county recorder's office myself, in person, and asked the woman at the counter to pull up the file and let me see it on the screen. She seemed mildly puzzled by the request. I did not explain. I just looked at it, every document in order. And then I thanked her and walked back out into the December cold, feeling lighter than I had in months. Carol's fees were paid by Daniel within 10 days, per the terms of the settlement. The check arrived in Carol's office on a Friday. She sent me a brief email with the word "received" in the subject line. That was all that needed to be said. But the story did not end there, because the consequences of what Daniel and Christina had attempted did not begin and end in a conference room. 3 weeks after the settlement, I received a call from a woman I did not know, a neighbor of Daniel and Christina's, it turned out, who had heard through a mutual acquaintance that there had been a legal matter. She had questions, she said carefully, about a contractor Daniel had recommended to her the previous spring. The contractor had done work on her kitchen that was now actively failing. Splitting grout, a section of tile that had been laid over inadequately prepared surface. And the contractor had stopped returning her calls. The contractor was someone Daniel had been referring regularly in the neighborhood, and she had learned recently that Daniel received a referral fee for each job. I referred her to Carol. I do not know exactly what followed from that call, but I know that Carol made several other calls, and that within 6 weeks, Daniel's employer, the Window and Home Improvement Company, where he had worked in sales for 9 years, had terminated his employment. The specific reason was not something I was ever told officially, but referral kickbacks and undisclosed financial arrangements with contractors were the kind of thing that sales companies and their legal teams took seriously, particularly when those arrangements had generated customer complaints that now carried the paper trail of a legal dispute. 9 years of employment, a territory he had built from scratch, a salary that had once been enough, gone in a single conversation with HR on a Tuesday morning, I was told later by someone who knew someone. He had driven home in the middle of the day, and Christina had met him at the door. I don't know what was said between them in that house, but I imagine the silence afterward was very loud. Christina's situation was, in some ways, worse because it was slower. She had, it emerged, been the one who had introduced Daniel to the attorney who had prepared the quitclaim deed. That attorney, a young man with a private practice, had not verified that the transaction was above board before drafting the document. Ohio's rules of professional conduct have a great deal to say about attorneys who prepare instruments for fraudulent conveyance, even if the fraud is ultimately not completed. A complaint was filed with the Ohio Supreme Court's Office of Disciplinary Counsel. I did not file it. I did not need to. When a legal matter of this kind becomes public record, the people withstanding to file complaints tend to find their way to the forms on their own. That process was slow and bureaucratic and entirely outside my involvement. But by the following spring, it had become something Daniel and Christina's marriage could not contain. The mortgage that had been 4 months behind in October was now something the bank's loss mitigation department was involved in. Their house, the matching mailbox development house, the one with HOA rules about fence height, went into a pre-foreclosure process in March. None of this was my doing. I want to be precise about that. I had not sought the unraveling of my son's life. I had sought the protection of my own. But these were the real consequences of what Daniel and Christina had set in motion. Not the artificial consequences of a story, but the actual, logical, sequential consequences of fraud, attempted by people who were already financially overextended and who had involved a third party, who had professional obligations and professional exposure. Every domino had been placed by their own hands. I had simply refused to be the first one pushed over. I thought about calling Daniel when I heard about the house. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, at the kitchen table, in the same chair where I had sat with my notepad in October, and written down everything I needed to do. The chair had not changed. The table had not changed. I had. Then I set it down. He had been given the chance to be my son in the way that word is supposed to mean something. He had made a choice. The consequences of that choice were not mine to absorb. There would always be a part of me that grieved the distance between the boy I had raised and the man he had become. That grief was real, and I did not dismiss it. But grief and responsibility are not the same thing, and I was done confusing them. I called Elise instead. "How do you feel?" she asked, as she always did. "Like someone who has been through something very long," I said, "and is on the other side of it." "Are you glad you fought?" I looked out the kitchen window at the garden. The azaleas along the back fence had already set their buds for spring. Woody at the base. Reliable. Old. "Yes," I said, "without question." Spring came the way it always does on Birchwood Lane, unhurriedly, with the azaleas first, then the tulips along the front walk, then the sudden extravagance of the rose that climbs the east fence and which I have never successfully pruned in any intentional way. I had repainted the green door in February when the weather broke briefly. Not a different color, the same green, a deep, particular shade called juniper that I had matched to Gerald's original paint chip, which I had kept in a kitchen drawer for 30 years in a small paper envelope. I do not know why I had kept it. Some things you keep without knowing why, and the reason only becomes clear later. I had stood on the front step with a brush in my hand in the thin February sun, painting slow, careful strokes over the wood, and I had thought, "This is mine. Every board and nail and painted surface of it is mine, and I defended it. And here I am." That thought had felt very good. My life in the months after the settlement had rearranged itself quietly, and I found, well, I had more time for the things I had let slide during the months of legal anxiety. I planted a new bed along the back fence. Lavender, this time. Properly placed where the drainage was right. Something I had been meaning to do for 2 years. I went back to the library on Thursdays, and my Thursday regulars, the retired teacher who came in for large print mysteries, the young father who brought his twins every week for story time, welcomed me back without ceremony, which was exactly what I needed. I took a watercolor class on Tuesday mornings at the community center, something I had wanted to try since a Thursday morning volunteer, a woman named Pat, had shown me a painting she was working on, and I had felt, unexpectedly, the particular ache of wanting to do something you have not allowed yourself to want. I was not good at watercolor. I was cheerfully, peacefully bad at it, and I found this enormously pleasant. My Tuesday instructor, a patient man named Hal, who wore the same canvas apron every week and never made anyone feel embarrassed, told me that the point of the class was not to make paintings, but to make time. Time that belonged to no one's agenda but your own. I thought about that for several days after he said it. He was right, of course. That was exactly what I had needed to learn. Elise came for dinner the second Friday of every month, and we would sit at the kitchen table until well past 10, talking about nothing and everything the way you can only do with someone you have known for decades. Her daughter, who lived in Portland, had had a baby that spring. A girl, 7 pounds and some ounces, with Elise's nose, reportedly, and Elise was planning to go out for 3 weeks in June, and this gave us a great deal to discuss. She was already compiling lists of things she wanted to teach the baby in due course. How to garden, how to read a map, how to tell when someone is lying to you. That last one, she said, looking at me. She had recently had a refresher course in herself. We laughed until we had to wipe our eyes. I was not in a hurry about anything. This was new, and it was good. Carol had become, over the course of the winter, something more than my attorney. Not a friend, precisely, but the kind of professional relationship that accrues its own warmth when you have been through something real together. She checked in periodically, not because anything required it, but because she was that kind of person. She mentioned, in the spring, that she was seeing more cases like mine. Elder financial exploitation, often by adult children, often enabled by instruments like powers of attorney that had been signed in good faith and then leveraged beyond their intent. She was working on a community education initiative, she said. She asked if I would ever consider speaking to a group. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks, walking through the neighborhood in the mornings, and what I kept returning to was the woman who had come to me in Daniel's neighbor's phone call. The woman with the failing kitchen tile, who had trusted a referral from someone she had no reason to distrust. And before that, the image of myself in October, sitting at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, not knowing what a quit-claim deed could do, not knowing what a power of attorney could be used for, not knowing what my rights were until I was already in danger. Someone had needed to tell me. No one had. I said yes in the end, in May. I stood in front of 23 people in a conference room at the Franklin County Senior Services Building and told them what I had heard outside my window, what I had done the next morning, and what had followed. I told them about the power of attorney and what it had nearly been used for. I told them about the recording and about the quit-claim deed already filled out and waiting in a manila envelope under a printed itinerary. I told them what they could do today to make themselves harder to exploit. Know what documents you have signed. Know who holds your power of attorney. Know that you can revoke it at any time. Know your attorney's number the way you know your doctor's number. 3 people came to speak to me afterward. One of them was shaking. I thought about that woman often in the weeks that followed. I hoped she had gone home and looked through her files. As for Daniel and Christina, I heard things, as you hear things in a life, not because you seek them out, but because communities are small and information moves through them the way water moves through soil. Quietly, inevitably, finding every low place. The foreclosure on their house was finalized in April. They had moved to a rental in a neighboring suburb, a 2-bedroom, from what I understood, a significant reduction from the 4-bedroom development house with its HOA and its matching mailboxes. Daniel had found work, from what I understood, but not in sales. Something operational, warehouse management, a significant step down from where he had been. He was 41 years old and starting over in a way that had nothing generous or chosen about it. I did not know whether he was bitter or chastened or simply exhausted. I suspected all three, in varying proportions on varying days. Christina. I heard from a neighbor who had seen her briefly at a grocery store in March, looked tired in the way that people look tired when the tiredness is not from work but from sustained internal pressure. Whatever fire had driven her, the certainty that she knew better than everyone, that the problem of their finances had a solution, and the solution was my house, had consumed a great deal of the fuel that was available, and what remained was not warmth. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to say I did and have it be the kind of ending that feels clean and complete. But the truth is more complicated. Daniel was still the person I had held in a hospital in 1983, the small, red-faced weight of him, the absolute marvel of him. Whatever he had become, or had perhaps always been underneath, that earlier version was also real, and I carried it the way I carried the paint chip in the kitchen drawer, in a small envelope, without knowing exactly why, against some future moment when the reason would become clear. But I also did not feel guilty. The outcomes in their life were the outcomes of their choices, carried to their logical ends. I had not pushed anything. I had only refused to be pushed. On a Saturday morning in late April, I sat in the garden with coffee and the newspaper and the specific, unhurried pleasure of a day with no obligations. The lavender had come in. The azaleas were at their absolute peak, that deep, almost embarrassing pink that lasts only about 10 days before it tips toward going. The green door was freshly painted. The sun was doing what the sun does in Ohio in late April. Arrive reluctantly, and then, once committed, give everything it has. I was 68 years old and I was at home and I was fine, more than fine. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. There is something I learned that October that I want to tell you directly. Love does not require you to hand someone the tools they need to destroy you. Trusting someone with your heart is not the same as trusting them with your life's work, your security, your future. I had confused those two things for a long time and nearly paid the full price for that confusion. If you heard voices outside your window, what would you have done? I hope you would have done exactly what I did, acted, documented, and stood firm. Thank you for listening to my story. If it helped you, or made you think, or reminded you that it is never too late to protect what you have built, I would be grateful if you would share it. Take care of yourselves.